So Finney, he's a lawyer, but he's so hungry. Here's the thing. Every one of these revivals, you can trace back to someone who was so hungry and someone who was so on fire and someone whose prayer life was just gripped with something supernatural from heaven. And Finney was so hungry that as a lawyer, he left his studies, or he left his practice to go and study the Word and pray. And he would go out into the woods for hours. And there's this one day where he's out in the woods praying, and he has this encounter with God, this incredible encounter that absolutely changed his life and changed our nation. He's in the woods praying, he's hungry, he's crying out to God, and he says, this is 1821, and listen to the language. The Holy Spirit descended upon me in such a manner that it seemed to go through me, body and soul. I could feel the impression like a wave of electricity going through and through me. Indeed, it seemed to come in waves of liquid love, for I could not express it in any other way. It seemed like the very breath of God. I can remember distinctly that it seemed to fan me like immense wings. No words can express the wonderful love that was spread abroad in my heart. And from that day forward, he went into ministry, and within a couple years, he was preaching all over the Northeast. And he had a model. He would go from city to city. He would rent out a schoolhouse or an auditorium or an old abandoned church. He would put up flyers around the town, and he would call people to the meetings. And usually the first night would be, not much. Maybe 20 people would come. A couple people would fall under conviction. But often the next day, supernatural things would start happening in the town, so that the next night there's a couple hundred people, and the third night the entire town comes out. There was many supernatural things that happened under the ministry of Finney, and you've probably heard of a lot of them. One of them, he's in this town, and he goes and he preaches the first night. I believe that it was either New York or Ohio. I was looking for it this morning and couldn't find which one it was, but he's preaching in this town, and not much happened the first night. And it was a small meeting, and there weren't hardly any children there. Well, the next night, at the schoolhouse in the town, the next morning at the schoolhouse in the town, a teacher is teaching her class, and a little girl starts to cry in the class. And she says, "What's the matter?" And she says, "I fear for my soul." And then another kid over here starts to cry and says, "I'm afraid of hell." And then another kid starts to cry and says, I fear for my soul. And there's just all of this conviction that's going on. And the teacher doesn't know what to do, so she's going to go out and get the principal. But whenever she walks out into the hall, all the teachers of all the classrooms are coming out into the hall, because the exact same thing is simultaneously happening in every one of the classrooms. And they go and get the principal, and the principal says, "Someone get me Mr. Finney to come and preach to my students. The salvation of their souls is more important than their education." And Finney comes and preaches, and the entire school gets saved. So needless to say, the next night, the house was packed, all the parents and all the families. There's another story in something Mills. It might just be Mills, New York, or something like that. In New York Mills, near Utica. This is a famous story. Finney's going to go in to meet with the owner of a cotton factory. And as he walks in, there's a woman ridiculing him, kind of heckling him. Finney doesn't say a word, but he's praying quietly as he walks past her, locking eyes with her, and she starts to tremble, and she starts to weep, and she starts to cry out in conviction. And then someone next to her starts to cry, and then someone next to them. And before long, this factory of 3,000 people, the majority of them are literally crying out. They're falling on the ground. They're groaning in conviction. Finney said it was probably the greatest demonstration of power he had ever seen. He didn't even speak a word. Now, the owner of the factory said, "Let's shut the place down and let Finney preach to my workers, because, again, their salvation is more important than our work here." There are amazing things that happened all over the place, but probably the most remarkable was what happened in Rochester, New York. In Rochester, New York, I want to talk just a couple minutes about. Finney had an incredible prayer life. His prayer life, he says, "I find I have more or less power in preaching and in personal labor for souls, just in proportion as I have had the spirit of prevailing prayer. I have found that unless I keep myself in relation to God as to have daily and hourly access to Him in prayer, my efforts to win souls are abortive. But that when I could prevail with God in prayer, I could prevail with men in preaching, exhortation, and conversion. He has this incredible prayer life. He would say things like, without prayer, I can do nothing. And one of the things that happened in Rochester is that there was a supernatural prayer movement that God had just breathed on the people in Rochester before Finney even came. And he started to meet all of these people who were gripped with a supernatural gift of travailing prayer. He talks about this one guy, Abel Clary, and he says he had known Abel Clary for years. They got saved in the same revival. And Abel Clary is staying with this man in Rochester, and the man comes up to Finney and he says, I don't know what to make of this man. For hours a day, he lies on the floor and groans, and he's in agonizing prayer, and he lays on the bed and rolls back and forth, and he cries out at the top of his lungs, I don't know what to make of it. And Finney says, he's going to be all right. He will prevail. It's okay. He's not going crazy. And then he goes on to list many men, many people that he knew, some of whom are influential. They're leaders in politics. They're leaders in the church. And many of them, their whole lives stopped for a season because they were so gripped with prayer that for days at a time, they couldn't leave their house. They literally, he would describe it as a spirit of prevailing prayer, and he would describe it as agonizing travail, where they were just gripped and they would just roll around on the floor groaning and crying out to God. One of the most famous of these intercessors was a man named Daniel Nash, who in the early years would go into a city before Finney, and he would rent out a room in a basement, and he would pray for a couple weeks before Finney would come into the town. He would open heaven over the city so that whenever Finney would come in to preach, people would just be getting saved left and right because the work was already done. Well, there was a supernatural, spontaneous prayer movement already happening in Rochester whenever Finney came into the town, and that was largely responsible for the revival. And so basically what happened was whenever he first arrived, there was this wealthy woman who was the wife of a prominent lawyer who came to meet with him. And she actually came to check him out because she had heard about Finney. And she heard that wherever Finney went, he shut down the parties. And she was looking forward to the winter party season. And she wanted to come check him out and see if he was really going to shut down her parties. And so in conversation with Finney, she gets so convicted, she starts to weep, she ends up getting born again, and she starts inviting all of her friends to his meetings. And Finney said, before long, my meetings were full of the most influential and prominent people in Rochester. All of the lawyers, all of the judges, all of the bankers, all of the leading architects and the leading mechanics in the city, even those who were in government, they were all coming to my meetings. It had such an impact on society, and Rochester was a town of less than 10,000 people, and it is historically documented that within a year's time of Finney laboring in Rochester, the surrounding area had over 100,000 people added to the church. They kept great records back then of who was in the church and who wasn't. 100,000 people came to the Lord in the space of less than a year of Finney laboring. There are 1,500 revivals in other towns in the area that directly came out of Rochester. There was one high school in Rochester where Finney preached. Something very similar happened. Revival breaks out in a classroom. They call Finney. Finney preaches, and pretty much the whole school gets saved. Out of this one high school, there were 40 people that became pastors, and there were over 40 people that went into missions. One of the men who got saved in the revival later went on to become like the state attorney general for New York. And he said he wanted to see what were the effects on the city. And he saw that from the time of I think it was 1831 or so, Rochester revival, for the next 20 years, the city had increased threefold in population, but crime had decreased by 2/3. So 2/3, so it's a ridiculous like 3,000% decrease in crime because of what happened here. It radically changed culture. There's accounts of multiple people saying that Rochester was a town of drunkenness, and it was a young town, and there was nightclubs they called dance halls where there was all kinds of immorality, and there was all kinds of just materialism. And after this revival swept through, there was this holiness that came on the entire city. There was a holy atmosphere in the streets and in the buildings. The churches were so packed out. There's one account where there were so many people crammed into a church building that they literally busted the building apart. The walls literally started to crack and the roof started to fall down, and people started diving out the windows because the church was so packed out it was bursting at the seams literally. This is one of the most remarkable revivals, and probably the most remarkable thing about it was that this supernatural prayer gripped the people. It gripped Finney, it gripped the people, and it prepared the way for the revival, and it prevailed throughout the revival and even after the revival. You know, Finney was one of the great forerunners in the anti-slavery movement. He actually was very influential in having slavery shut down, just as the First Great Awakening was the precursor to the American Revolution, which meant that we became a free nation. The Second Great Awakening was the precursor to the Civil War and the ending of slavery. Later, with Azusa Street, they had non-segregated meetings. And on into the 40s and 50s healing revival, they had non-segregated meetings. These preachers literally became the foremost voices in the civil rights movement. Finney was one of the loudest voices for anti-slavery. He got banned from some places because of that. I mean, this was remarkable, society-transforming, city of God manifest, heaven pouring into earth, people getting saved and delivered, and society being transformed. The city was never the same. They literally talked about the jails being empty for years, and the police force a fraction of the size, and judges having little to do because there's no more criminal cases in the courts. This radically transformed, and I think you can trace this revival back as well as Azusa Street, and as well as Wales, as well as the First Great Awakening with Jonathan Edwards, which you don't have to go time to go into. You can trace them back to a people who were so hungry for God. They were so desperate and they were so gripped with fire from heaven that something supernatural descended on them so that they were no longer their own, but they became a conduit for travailing prayer to birth something into the earth. And men and women of God, there were many mighty women of God in these moves as well. Men and women of God became gripped with a message where they became heaven's mouthpiece, and where their words had such authority that they made prophetic declarations over cities and over nations that literally changed history. We're still riding the wave of the revival that broke out Second Great Awakening, which made the way for Azusa Street, which is a fire that is still burning today.